Welcome to today's webinar, Chemicals Quarterly Q1 2025 Regulatory Update. So we're delighted to have you here with us today. And as always, I'm just going to give a little bit of orientation about the webinar platform before I introduce our speakers for today. So the webinar slides are available to the left side of your screen, along with a few helpful links if you'd like to explore and learn more about compliance and risks and how we can simplify and accelerate your compliance processes. We want this webinar to be as engaging as possible, so please do send us any questions you may have, and we'll aim to address them during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. If you would like to submit a question for this session, please use the Ask a Question widget, on the left side of your screen. And we'll also follow up directly with you for any questions that we don't get to during the webinar today. At any time, if you're interested in having a member of our team reach out to you, this is when you use the Start a Conversation button at the bottom of your screen. And last but not least, the webinar recording will be sent to you within 24 hours. So my name is Orla Morris. I'm Content Marketing Manager here at Compliance and Risks, and I'm delighted to be joined by the wonderful Kim Plassche and Cassie Persian. Kim is a Senior Regulatory Content Specialist on the Content Research and Development team, specialising in international product safety legislation. With a strong focus on chemicals and products and environmental regulation, she stays at the forefront of the evolving regulatory landscape. Kim holds a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Studies and a Master of Library Science, both from the University of Buffalo. Before joining Compliance and Risks, Kim gained extensive experience in university, public and private libraries. She is also a published author with articles and research contributions featured in peer-reviewed journals and academic texts. Additionally, Kim has significant experience in the consumer products testing industry and has provided research and technical support for both internal testing teams and external clients. So thank you so much for joining us today, Kim.
Thank you, Orla.
And we're also joined by the wonderful Cassie Persian, a Senior Regulatory Content Specialist on the Content Research and Development team here at Compliance and Risks, responsible for the creation and management of essential regulatory information. A librarian by training with 16 years experience in the consumer products industry, she specialises in global research for clients across the supply chain. Based in Buffalo, New York City area, she currently enjoys a focus on product labeling and chemical restrictions, as well as her recent participation in ASTM standards development. Thank you so much for joining us today, Cassie.
Thank you, Orla.
So before we kick off the webinar, I would like to provide a background about compliance and risks for those who are joining us for the first time today. At Compliance and Risks, our mission is to help ensure global companies have the tools and information to build safe, sustainable products in a world full of change. We are the trusted product compliance technology provider for the world's leading brands and have spent 2 decades honing the digital tools, expertise, and content you need to stay ahead of the dynamic regulatory landscape and prove your product's compliance, protecting your brands and helping drive your growth. At Compliance and Risks, we have the world's most comprehensive regulatory database with over 100,000 regulations historically available in C2P. With a global regulatory coverage and expertise across over 10 industries, we understand that regulatory compliance definitely doesn't sleep. And our regulatory expert team is truly global, with 28 collective languages spoken across the team, all fortified by our 30 knowledge partners. C2P is our enterprise software designed to keep global organizations on top of regulatory changes and their impact worldwide. This includes early warning alerts, impact probability, productivity workflow tools, and so much more. And with that, I am delighted to hand it over to you, Cassie.
Thank you, Orla. So welcome, everyone. For those of us joining for the first time, These chemical quarterlies give Kim and I the opportunity to share some key highlights in regulatory chemical development for the previous quarter. So I'm going to run through activity from a global standpoint, Asia, Pacific, and Europe to start, and then Kim will take over for the Americas. So I'm going to start with global. Like I said, the 2025 versions of both AFIRM and AAFA's restricted substance lists were released in February. AFIRM is short for Apparel and Footwear International RSL Management Working Group, and it published its 10th edition of its RSL on February 1st. The AFIRM RSL leverages their mission, which is to reduce the use and impact of harmful substances in the apparel and footwear supply chain by providing a single set of information for maximum and in-depth implementation. The primary product focus is apparel and footwear, but may also be applied to accessories, jewelry, sporting goods equipment, wearables, and home textiles. The AFIRM RSL is updated annually by February 1st each year. On February 6th, the American Apparel and Footwear Association, or AAFA, issued its 25th edition of their RSL. The new version covers 16 categories with more than 250 chemicals, and it's updated to reflect additions or changes to relevant regulations and laws. The AAFA RSL provides a reference of all banned and restricted chemicals and substances for finished apparel, footwear, accessories, and home textile products, and identifies the most restrictive regulations worldwide. There's also, in the AAFA RSL, there's an appendix on reporting, and it covers U.S. states whose laws require reporting of chemicals in children's products, and it also covers European reporting rules. Both of these RSLs are public access and can be found on their respective websites. And then we have a couple of things going on in Australia and New Zealand. The Australian Industrial Chemicals Introduction Scheme is seeking feedback on the clarity of information requirements to be added to the form for their assessment certificate application for designated fluorinated chemicals. These are a subset of PFAS that are of highest concern to human health and environment, and includes longer chain PFAS chemicals that are similar to PFOS, PFOA, and PFHXS. The introduction scheme assesses the health and environment risks of designated fluorinated chemicals that are not currently on the Australian inventory of industrial chemicals after an application for assessment certificate is submitted. So the chemical can only be manufactured or imported into Australia if AICIS issues an assessment certificate. Information requirements for these certificate applications are based on the latest scientific knowledge about PFAS. It includes requirements for toxicological studies on the chemical and information about impurities and degradation products. The consultation for this closed on April 8th. Following a public consultation in the fall of 2024, on March 10th, the New Zealand Minister for Environment received cabinet approval to restrict 3 persistent organic pollutants that were recently added to the Stockholm Convention. Methoxychlor, Declarine Plus, and UV328 are now restricted under Schedule 2A of the Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act, or HSNO Act. So these chemicals have been making their rounds in the news the last couple of quarters. Just as a reminder, methoxychlor is an insecticide. Declarine Plus is a flame retardant used in adhesives and sealants. And UV328 is used to protect surfaces against discoloration and degradation under sunlight. This amendment went into force on March 14th. And then that was it for that area. We're going to hop right over into Asia. They were busy this quarter. On February 25th, China's Ministry of Ecology and Environment initiated feedback on the indicative lists of 3 groups of PFAS chemicals. The initiative seeks to assist China in meeting its obligations under the Stockholm Convention and is designed to gather information on long-chain PFCAs, their salts and related compounds, and the same for PFOA and PFHXS. The consultation is accompanied by 3 annexes containing the list of indicative substances. And comments will are open until May 19th. On March 4th, the China Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, China's SAC and SAMR jointly published an announcement revising GB 30981.2, which is a standard on establishing the limits of harmful substances for industrial coatings. The draft standard proposes to update several GB standards on harmful substances in coatings and consolidate it into one version. It specifies, of course, the terms, the definitions, classification rules, test methods, inspection rules, marking requirements, and then, of course, the permissible limits of hazardous substances. The draft standard applies to various types of industrial coatings and their auxiliary materials used for decoration, protection, or other functional purposes, including on-site paintings and industrial paintings on wood, metal, plastic, concrete, composite material, glass, ceramics, and other substrate surfaces. The standard proposes to control substances like VOCs, formaldehyde, benzene, toluene, and xylene, heavy metals, biocides, phthalates, asbestos, and a few others. Additionally, there's a chapter that specifies that products that have passed inspection should display this information on their packaging. It further clarifies additional labeling requirements for specific products such as toy and wood coatings, including varnishes of consumer products in close contact with humans should include a coating hazard marking on the packaging. Industrial coatings and putty must display hazard markings either on the packaging or in the product manual, and then markings can be in text or QR codes. Solvent-based coatings containing active dilutants or designed for water addition must clearly state this on the packaging or in the product manual. And then multi-component curing coatings such as polyurethane or epoxy should indicate in the packaging or product manuals the product's usable period. And then lastly, specialized functional coatings and zinc aluminum coatings must include the VOC content under application conditions in the packaging or manuals. The deadline for comments was March 11th. On March 20th, the Chinese National Center for Food Safety Risk Assessment proposed a draft announcement requesting public comment on new food contact materials. The proposal would expand the use of 3 additives for food contact materials and products and include a hexane dioic acid polymer for use in paints and coatings, an ammonium salt of dodecanoic acid for use in paintings and coatings, and then this substance that I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce for use in an unsaturated polyester resin plastic. The draft announcement prohibits the use of these last 2 substances in paints and coatings for food, contact materials, and products for infants and young children. Specific migration limits and labeling requirements are also set out in the draft, and the deadline for comments was April 19th. Moving over to India, on February 24th, the Indian Ministry of Environment, Forest, and Climate Change published an amendment to their battery waste management rules. The text amends the 2022 battery waste management rules, specifically Schedule 1, Paragraph 2. And among changes and exemptions and labeling, the requirement to mark batteries with the chemical symbols for cadmium and lead is waived if their concentration is below specified thresholds of 0.002% for cadmium and 0.004% for lead. These rules entered into force on February 24th. On February 3rd, the Jordan Ministry of Health published lists of prohibited and limited chemicals in Official Gazette number 5980. This supersedes the previous list published in November of 2012. Frequently cited in this list are chemicals which are prohibited to use in the manufacture of textile products that come in direct contact with the skin. So items like clothing and nightwear, linens, that sort of thing. Lead in its compounds in the household paint industry, provided that it does not exceed the percentage of this material, is in unintended and unsafe household paints directly. So the percentage by weight of the unsafe content of lead is equal to or less than 0.009%. These lists include an appendix of restricted substances and maximum concentration limits by weight in homogeneous materials. For Japan, this slide is meant to say PFAS. It didn't make the my latest editing cuts. That's okay. On January 8th, the Japanese Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry issued an announcement on import clearance procedures for chemical substances, which adds specific PFAS substances and their products to Annexes 1 and 2. Annex 1 provides a list of Class 1 specified substances, which includes 35 types of chemicals. This announcement also adds several PFAS substances to this annex. And then Annex 2 provides a list of products that cannot be imported if any of these Annex 1 Class 1 specified chemicals are used. The products added to Annex 2 are some of the stuff we see common with PFAS. We have, the water and oil repellent textiles, anti-foaming agents, all other water repellent, oil repellents, optical fiber or its surface coating agents, the fire extinguishers and agents and foams, and then water and oil repellent floor coverings and floor waxes. The announcement also provides details of import customs procedures for chemical substances, and this entered into force 2 days after publication on January 10th. On January 20th, the Japanese Consumer Affairs Agency proposed an amendment to the specifications and standards for food and food additives to prohibit the use of Class 1 specified chemical substances as raw materials for food utensils, containers, and packaging. Class 1s are persistent, highly accumulative, and have long-term or chronic toxicity, and they are designated under the Chemical Substances Control Law and its related ordinances. This amendment also introduces a mechanism for specifying substances by accepting individual applications and publishing those substances that have undergone safety review procedures. Comments were due on February 20th. On January 31st, Singapore published an order to further restrict the use of mercury and persistent organic pollutants in various products, aligning with international efforts. This is an amendment of the second schedule under the Environmental Protection and Management Act. Affected product categories and the new restrictions included general restriction for mercury in controlled electrical and electronic equipment, now set at a maximum concentration value of 0.1% by weight of homogeneous material. The limit for mercury in all batteries, including button cells, is now a maximum of 0.0005% by weight per cell. Fluorescent lamps, primarily for general lighting, range from not more than 5 milligrams of mercury per most lamp types to not more than 10 milligrams of mercury per circular and other linear fluorescent lamps. The amendment also refines the exemptions for mercury in certain measuring devices, allowing them only under specific conditions. Other products include photographic paper and propellants, which is now excluded if they contain mercury or mercury compounds. The order enters into force on August 1st. On January 24th, the South Korean Ministry of Environment proposed 2 draft amendments to the Registration and Assessment of Chemical Substance Enforcement Ordinance, also known as K-REACH. The first draft aims to establish criteria for designated hazardous substances and to specify matters delegated by the revised K-REACH Act, as well as those necessary for its implementation. So the revision removes the existing definition of toxic substances and introduces new definitions for acutely and chronically toxic substances, and then ecotoxic substances. The draft also reflects other terminology changes following the Act's revision. It also expands the list of chemicals requiring hazard assessment in accordance with a review of submitted chemical substance data and the revision of disclosure of chemical substance information. It also revises the scope of information that may be disclosed despite a request for data protection. The second draft K-REACH amendment aims to establish criteria for substances with unconfirmed hazards. The proposal has measures for updating notification requirements to include cases where the criteria for substances with unconfirmed hazards is no longer met. It establishes procedures for assessing the adequacy of submitted data. It reflects and incorporates terminology changes, as the previous one did. It revises provisions on the disclosure of chemical information to include substances with unconfirmed hazards. And then it adjusts and aligns registration and notification criteria for new chemicals and submission methods for test data. Feedback for both of these drafts were accepted until March 25th. And that wraps it up for Asia. Let's hop on over to Europe. This is actually left over from last quarter. On December 19th, the EU Directorate General for Health and Food Safety released news on the adoption of a ban on the use of bisphenol A in food contact materials. The adoption was made due to the potentially harmful health impacts of BPA, particularly on the immune system. The ban prohibits BPA in products that come in contact with food or drink, including coatings on metal cans, reusable plastic drink bottles, water distribution coolers, and various kitchenware. There will be an 18-month phase-out period for most products, with limited exceptions where no alternatives are available to prevent disruption in the supply chain. Additionally, the ban extends to other bisphenols that are harmful to reproductive and endocrine systems. Prior to this decision, BPA was already banned in the EU, but for infant bottles and similar products. And this regulation entered into force on January 20th. Formally adopted on December 16th and published in the official journal on January 22nd, Regulation 2025/40 advances the EU's sustainable packaging and waste management goals. Replacing Directive 94/62/EC, it addresses the entire packaging life cycle to support the circular economy and climate neutrality. So key measures from this new packaging directive include restricting PFAS and other harmful chemicals in food contact packaging through a threshold limit and a gradual phase out. The regulation entered into force on February 11th, and it applies from August 12th of 2026. And with this new packaging regulation, ECHA takes on a new role to improve the safety of packaging materials. The first task for ECHA is to support the European Commission by preparing a study identifying chemicals of concern in packaging and related components, assessing how these chemicals affect their safety, reuse, and recycling. They are to provide its input to the Commission by the end of September of 2026. Based on this report, the Commission will then consider appropriate follow-up measures, including possible restrictions on the use of substances and packaging material that pose health or environmental risks. These restrictions will follow the existing REACH process. On February 18th, the EU Commission proposed a draft delegated regulation to amend EU's persistent organic pollutant regulation regarding exemption limits for polybrominated diphenyl ethers, including tetra, penta, hexa, hepta, and deca-BDEs. The proposal aims to establish a limit for the presence of PBDEs as unintentional trace contaminants, or UTC, in substances, mixtures, and articles. It introduces a phased reduction UTC limit for PBDE present in mixtures or articles containing or made of recycled material containing recyclate mixtures. So it'll start with 500 milligrams per kilogram upon entry into force, which would be the 20th day following its publication in the EU official journal. And then as of December 30th, 2025, the limit would go down to 350 milligrams per kilogram. And then finally, 200 milligrams per kilogram as of December 30th, 2027. For other mixtures and articles, the limit is 10 milligrams. Comments on the technical and economic feasibility of the proposed limits and the potential impact on industries were due on March 18th. On March 25th, Belgium took a significant step by introducing a bill in its Chamber of Representatives aimed at restricting PFAS in specific product areas. This legislative action mirrors efforts in France and Denmark, responding to increasing worries about forever chemicals and the environmental persistence and implication of these PFAS. The bill specifically seeks to prohibit PFAS in food contact materials like packaging and cookware. The proposal also extends to textile products, including clothing and upholstery, as well as cosmetics and wax products like those used in skiing. The bill does include strict exemptions for essential applications where no alternatives exist, especially concerning certain textiles vital for national security or civil defense. The draft legislation outlines specific timelines for phasing out PFAS in the targeted product groups, and manufacturers and importers would need to ensure compliance to avoid potential penalties and fines, which could amount to €120,000. And France also took a significant step by adopting their PFAS ban on February 20th. Aligning with the EU's chemical strategy for sustainability, the approved text aims to phase out these harmful chemicals and encourage safer alternatives. Article 1 directly tackles the risk of PFAS by preventing their manufacture, import, export, and placement on the market of certain products. It's important to note that this ban considers whether there are already safer alternatives available for these products. So effective January 1st of 2026, clothing, footwear, cosmetics, and certain waxes containing PFAS will be prohibited. Furthermore, placing on the market of any textile products containing PFAS will be prohibited from January 1st of 2030. Beyond product bans, Article 2 of the law also addresses water quality, and it introduces a tax of €100 per 100 grams discharged on manufacturers whose activities lead to PFAS discharge. I also just want to mention a new white paper that is just published today. It's called PFAS Under Pressure, and it covers key trends and challenges worldwide. So if you're interested in reading more about these PFAS restrictions at a global level, it is now available on our website to download. On January 22nd, Turkey's Ministry of Environment, Urbanization, and Climate proposed draft procedures and principles for implementing their KKDIK REACH regulation. The draft outlines the specific procedures and timelines for implementation, focusing on the registration process, collaboration among companies, and the establishment of advisory bodies. Once adopted, these procedures and principles will enter into force on the date of publication. Comments were due on January 27th. Another holdover from last quarter, on December 31st, and effective the very next day, the Turkish Ministry of Trade issued a communique to regulate the procedures and principles for conformity assessment in the importation of substances, mixtures, and goods. These are listed in various annexes under different customs regimes and aligns with international agreements like the Montreal Protocol and its Kigali Amendment. The import of ozone-depleting substances and goods containing or operating with these substances is prohibited with some exceptions. The import of substances in disposable pressurized containers is also prohibited. The import of fluorinated greenhouse gases are subject to quota and would require a fluorocarbon control certificate. Import of most other substances, mixtures, and goods is prohibited with some allowances for exemptions met in the regulation on persistent organic pollutants. With regards to import procedure, chemicals covered in various lists may require control certificates or exemption declarations. And a 45-day transition period is allowed for goods already in transit or presented to customs before the January 1st, 2025 effective date. Finally, from my end, British draft legislation on persistent organic pollutants proposed last quarter has been adopted. On March 11th, the UK government issued 2 pieces of legislation to revise its retained POP regulation. Amendment 1 revises Part 1 of Annex 1 by introducing a UTC limit value for hexachlorobenzene and pentachlorophenol when these are present in substances, mixtures, or articles. Revising several provisions for PFOA under specific exemption on intermediate use or other application. And it adds new entries for Declarane Plus, methoxychlor, and UV328 with a UTC limit value for each of those chemicals. It also brings changes to the waste requirements for several POPs listed in Annexes 4 and 5. Amendment 2 updates the entries for Declarane Plus and UV328 listed in Part A of Annex 1 to the POP recast by allowing certain time-limited applications for these substances. Both of these revisions came into effect on April 1st. And that does it for me. I'm going to hand it over to Kim.
Thank you, Cassie. You covered so much, and I'm afraid to say it is not just that side of the globe that's had a lot going on for the beginning of our year here. Starting off with South America, and specifically in Brazil. We might recall that in 2024, Anvisa consulted on the proposed addition of 2 chemicals to the positive list of authorized substances in the nation's food contact plastics regulation. This was under RDC number 56 of 2021. On February 10th of this year, that proposed addition was finalized in RDC number 961. This applies to manufacturers of plastic packaging and equipment in contact with food and incorporates Mercosur Resolution 28 of 24 into Brazil's national law. These revisions add TMBPF DGE to Annex 1 that includes the monomers and other authorized initiating substances, and PAI2 to Annex 2 for authorized polymers. Anvisa also published RDC number 963 this quarter. This one amends RDC 326 of 2019 on the positive list of additives for preparation of plastic materials and polymeric coatings in contact with food. This resolution implements Mercosur Resolution 22 of 24 and adds silver glass and diethyl amino ethanol to the annex of RDC 326. Moving on to Chile, just a reminder that first deadline for the registration of hazardous substances for industrial use has now passed. So hopefully you attended our previous webinar or you were tracking that one on your own and you didn't miss it. Now the focus is on the notification of hazardous substances intended for non-industrial use. This applies to substances that are classified as hazardous under the Chilean GHS framework, provided that they are not part of a mixture and their production or import volume exceeds 1 metric ton per year. Non-industrial use includes substances used in specialized professional tasks besides manufacturing, so something like pesticides, as well as those that are available to consumers for general domestic purposes. The notification window for these substances opened on February 9th and closes on August 30th. Some news from Colombia with their own REACH-like regulation. This deadline is coming up quick, so hopefully you were already aware of this. May 30th, notification is required for all hazardous industrial substances, and that includes those that are in mixture. There is a threshold for registration of 1 ton per year over 3 years. Information that you should have prepared for registration should look familiar at this point, and it includes producer identification, hazard classification, and recommended uses. So moving on to North America, starting off at the federal level here in the US, I just want to quickly point out that there have been a few IRIS toxicological reviews released. We have 2 finals that were published this quarter for inorganic arsenic as well as PFHXS. These were both reviewed, and those final assessments address potential for cancer and non-cancer human health effects from exposure to the substances. These assessments will now be available for use by the EPA for future decision making. The EPA also announced the release of the draft IRIS toxicological review of chloroform. This was open for a 60-day public comment period, which closed on February 18th. The comments on the interagency science consultation draft were also released at the same time. Although that comment period has now passed, this is something to be aware of for future regulatory actions on chloroform, which may be used in solvents and other products. EPA has added 9 additional PFAS to the toxics release inventory. This happened on January 3rd. It takes effect for reporting year 2025. And just a reminder that facilities within designated industry sectors and federal facilities are required to report annually to the EPA regarding their management of TRI listed chemicals exceeding the specified thresholds. This reporting includes quantities of these chemicals that are released to the environment or otherwise managed as waste. The data collection informs communities about local facility chemical management practices and is made publicly available. The final rule was originally effective on February 5th. However, as a result of Trump's January 20th memorandum regulatory freeze pending review, the effective date was changed to March 21st. It seems that there was no additional extension, so that March 21st date does remain. A few more actions under TSCA to report for the quarter. In January, the effective date for many final regulations were delayed in accordance with that regulatory freeze. Of particular interest is the final rule for TCE, which we covered during the last CQ. This was initially set to come into effect on January 16th, but the effective date did change to March 21st, like we saw with those PFAS TRI additions. Similarly, there have been a few reopening of comment periods for a few notices that we covered previously. The EPA proposed to address CI pigment violet 29 under its conditions of use per the 2021 risk evaluation and September 22 revised risk determinations. The comment period for this was reopened this quarter, and that ended on February 28th. PV29 is used across many industries, including for watercolors, paints, inks, cleaning and washing agents, pharmaceuticals, industrial carpeting, and more. So I just wanted to bring up that comment period did close, but it was reopened at that point. We also saw an extension of the review period for confidential business information claims for specific identities of all active chemical substances listed on the confidential portion of the TSCA inventory submitted to the EPA. EPA determined that a further extension of the statutory review period for the review of those CBI claims is necessary, and it has been extended to February 19th, 2026. Also, under TSCA, the EPA conducts risk evaluations to assess if a chemical poses an unreasonable risk to health or the environment. This assessment is done focusing solely on that risk and not other factors such as costs. The EPA released a few of these final risk evaluations under TSCA this quarter. There were also 2 that were open for comments, which closed last month that I've listed on the slide here. I don't have the time to delve into details on these, but please do review the list when we send the presentation out. On January 6th, the agency issued a significant new use rule for 6 specific substances that I've listed on the slide here. It came into effect on March 7th. Just a reminder that when a SNR is issued, it amends 40 CFR to add the listed substances to the list of chemicals that manufacturers and importers must notify the EPA about at least 90 days before starting any activity designated as a significant new use. That notification will then alert the EPA to evaluate the conditions of the proposed use, and production cannot begin until that evaluation is complete and any actions determined by the EPA have been taken. So we covered briefly again in our Q4 webinar that on December 13th, the EPA finalized the health and safety reporting rule requiring manufacturers of the 16 listed chemical substances here to submit any unpublished health and safety studies to the EPA. This applies to manufacturers who have produced those substances in the last 10 years or plan to do so in the future. The required studies include any on health effects, environmental effects, and exposure. In response to requests from stakeholders, the EPA did amend that deadline from March 23rd to June 11th for vinyl chloride and to September 9th for the remaining 15 substances. So on to the states, starting off with California. Vinyl acetate has been added to the Prop 65 list as a carcinogen. The warning requirement for significant exposures to the chemical take effect on January 3rd, 2026. Also in California, AB 1148 was introduced. This bill proposes to prohibit the distribution, sale, or offering for sale of food packaging containing certain hazardous chemicals listed on the screen here, including orthophthalates, bisphenols, and antimony trioxide. This would begin January 1st, 2027. The term food packaging is broadly defined in the bill to include disposable containers, wrappers, plates, bowls, trays, takeout containers, and other items that are used to contain, serve, store, or handle food and beverages. Georgia introduced House Bill 9 this quarter, which aims to establish a Safer States Act and to prohibit the use of certain chemical flame retardants in various consumer products that include bedding, carpeting, children's products, residential upholstered furniture, and window treatments. Starting on January 1st, 2026, manufacturers and retailers would be banned from selling products containing the prohibited chemical flame retardants listed here in amounts exceeding 1,000 parts per million. The Office of Safety Fire Commissioner would be required to review that list and recommend additional chemical flame retardants for prohibition every 3 years. Manufacturers would also be required to provide notice to retailers about the presence of listed chemicals. Minnesota proposed SF 1380. This one would prohibit 18 specific prohibited packaging chemicals, including substances like polyvinyl chloride, polystyrene, bisphenols, halogenated flame retardants, and various other chemical compounds that are considered potentially harmful, with an effective date of January 1st, 2028. This would again be reviewed every 3 years. Manufacturers must also respond to inquiries about their packaging's chemical composition with trade secret information protected as non-public data. New York has also been busy this quarter proposing substance legislation across several product categories. In alphabetical order, I've pulled out a few of interest and put them on the screen here. Starting off with A 1976, this relates to toxic chemicals in pet products. It would require manufacturers to disclose the presence of priority chemicals and chemicals of high concern in pet products, including toys, apparel, and other pet-related items. The bill defines a very long list of specific chemicals of concern, such as lead, mercury, formaldehyde, and various potentially harmful compounds, and it mandates that manufacturers report the use of these chemicals. By January 1st, 2028, the bill would prohibit the sale of pet products containing priority chemicals that have been on that list for at least 1 year. A 3661 aims to amend the New York State Environmental Conservation Law to require that any state rules or regulations concerning hydrofluorocarbon substances align with and not exceed the standards established by the US EPA. Specifically, the bill defines HFCs as chemicals that are used in air conditioning and refrigeration equipment, aerosol propellants, and foam end uses. S 1767 and or /A 4542 aim to prohibit the manufacture, sale, and use of cookware containing polytetrafluoroethylene. Then we've got, I'm a little out of order. A 6500 was also proposed. While lead is already restricted in children's products, furniture, and raw paint at the federal level, the bill seeks to regulate the heavy metal in all consumer products in the state. The law defines a consumer product as any tangible good sold or manufactured in the state which is movable at the time it is conveyed by the seller to another party. Consumer products should include components of products under this bill. S 2540 aims to prohibit the manufacture, distribution, and sale of certain toys and child care products containing specific phthalates. The legislation defines toys as products designed for children to play with, and child care articles as items intended to help children sleep, relax, feed, or manage teething. The bill does set strict limits on the concentration of several phthalates, banning their use in concentrations exceeding 0.1%. For toys and products intended for children under 3 years old that might be placed in a child's mouth, additional restrictions do apply to specific phthalates. Manufacturers, of course, would be required to use the least toxic alternative for replacing those chemicals. Finally, S 6816 aims to eliminate the mandatory use of toxic flame retardants for tents that hold fewer than 15 people, as well as children's play tents, camping tents, and other recreational tents constructed with fabric made entirely from synthetic fibers. Moving on to Rhode Island, and let's see here. I actually noticed as I was reviewing these before we started, I have the bill number wrong. It's H5492 for this one. So if you're tracking these, please do note that that is incorrect. This bill creates the Microplastics Reduction Act, which would prohibit manufacturers from selling products containing intentionally added synthetic polymer microparticles starting January 1st, 2029. This law defines microplastics as small synthetic particles added to or notably resulting from the breakdown of products. On February 3rd, Washington State Senate introduced SB 5628. This bill updates the state regulations on lead content in cookware by expanding and clarifying definitions. The bill defines cookware to include metal pots, pans, bakeware, rice cookers, pressure cookers, and utensils, but it explicitly excludes large appliances like ranges that don't have metal food contact surfaces. It introduces a new definition of inaccessible components to distinguish between parts of cookware that can and cannot come into contact with food. Starting on January 1st, 2026, the bill would prohibit the sale of cookware or cookware components containing lead or lead compounds at levels exceeding 5 parts per million. So you may have noticed that I didn't talk about PFAS at all. I wasn't forgetting about it. There really have been so many bills introduced at the state level related to PFAS this quarter. To be honest, it's a little chaotic. We see some of the same states that are introducing bills almost product by product or for certain topics while also introducing comprehensive phased rollouts. And that doesn't even include bills that are pertaining to drinking water or farmland, things that we aren't usually checking here at CNR. Tracking those is a full-time job, probably for many more than one person. So with that being said, I did try to make a list of some of the more significant bills introduced in the US at the state level relating to PFAS. I won't go through each of these individually. If they are new to you or something that you think you need to keep up on, please check the scope and dates to ensure you will not be too surprised if they are enacted. I looked through these trying to find trends or consistencies to pull out and highlight, but honestly, it is tough to draw comparisons to these apples to apples, as you might say. So we do see a lot of the usual suspects for products, such as carpets, cookware, cosmetics, and so on. But then Minnesota is here attempting to regulate electronic components specifically, which is novel at this point. I do want to apologize that I included Kentucky and Maine twice. Please note that you aren't missing any bills here, just that I accidentally put it in the table twice. And I do also want to point out that I did not forget Nevada's SB 173, or I'm sorry, SB 76A. SB 173 and 76A were both introduced early in this session, but 76A died on February 11th. So with so much else going on, I really wanted to focus on what is still possibly in play. And as we finish up here, I do want to mention Victoria Smart, my colleague here at CNR. She wrote a fantastic white paper on PFAS developments in the US, which does include states, that was published a few weeks ago. It does give additional information that we obviously can't cover here, and it does also have a good overview of requirements that are already in force. So please check out our white papers on our website. And I did also want to just point out to for Vermont, they are proposing to add dental floss and cleaning products to their regulations that are already in force. So finishing up in Canada, we saw significant new activity notices 21912 and 21861 were published for the substances I've listed on the screen here. This notice requires that an individual or corporation engaging in a significant new activity in relation to those named substances would submit a significant new activity notification containing all of the information listed in each individual notice. Again, like the US, this would be 90 days prior to using that substance for the significant new activity. Each of the notices does have different concentration quantities and other parameters. So if these chemicals are a concern for you, please be sure to check those. The Ministry of Environment also published Ministerial Condition number 2197. This condition permits the manufacture or import of the substance multi-walled carbon nanotubes, where at least 96% of the substance is composed of elemental carbon, and it falls within the size specifications outlined. I've listed those on the screen here. The order specifically prohibits the use of the substance in consumer products that may generate respirable particles through things like aerosols, sprays, or mists, as well as in coatings and structural building materials above specific concentration limits of 0.01% for coatings and 0.06% for structural materials. This came into effect on February 21st. Back in 2024, we discussed Canada's proposal to regulate coal tars, PAH, and 2BE. Those regulations have now been published. The prohibitions begin on October of this year, and notably, the old 2BE regulations are repealed and replaced. We're running pretty low on time, but I've included plenty of detail on this slide for your review when we send those out. Quite a few orders were also published during this last quarter, amending the domestic and non-domestic substances lists. Again, we don't have time to cover each of these, but I did want to be sure to put the citations in the slide here for your review. There are also changes to Part 2, Schedule 1 of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. PFAS is proposed, as well as two that have come into effect. But speaking of that PFAS edition, on March 5th, the Government of Canada published their State of PFAS report to inform future actions and consultations with industry and other stakeholders. This report is proposing to add the class of PFAS, excluding fluoropolymers, to Part 2 of Schedule 1 of that Environmental Protection Act. A phased approach is considered, starting with addressing PFAS in firefighting foam. The next step would be to address the uses of PFAS in consumer products where alternatives do exist, such as certain textiles, building materials, and food packaging. Finally, the government plans to continue evaluating other sectors through stakeholder consultations. This is open for comments, and comments are due in just a few weeks. Finishing up with some news from one of Canada's provinces, Nova Scotia proposed Bill 34 in February, which would prohibit the sale of products containing intentionally added PFAS beginning January 1st, 2028. This would apply to all products with deliberately added PFAS, except for medical devices approved by Health Canada and those that are deemed essential products. With the Canadian government still reviewing their state of PFAS plans, it will be interesting to track this bill to learn if we will see a similar situation as we have in the United States, with a more localized governments tackling the issue and setting a standard for the rest of the nation. But that is all for me, and I think I'm handing it back to Orlana. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much for that extremely detailed overview. There's plenty to cover there. So as Kim said, the slides for this webinar will be made available to everyone to look through it more thoroughly. But thank you so much for your attention so far. And I know we are short on time, but we do have a few minutes left to run through a few questions. Again, if you have a question that you'd like us to answer, please let us know using the Ask a Question widget to the left side of your screen. So I'll just focus on one or two now, given the time. But the first question is, regarding the France PFAS ban, what do they consider all textiles?
I can answer this, Orla. Yeah, so according to the adopted text, a wider PFAS restriction will apply to all types of textiles starting in 2030. It will likely expand to products like furnishings and upholstery. And it does look like there will be exemptions for like industrial textiles and specific materials considered necessary for essential use. And it also looks like the details on what exactly will be exempt will be clarified in future legislation. So I guess stay tuned.
Perfect. And do you have any information about Montana's proposal for PFAS?
This one's for me. So, yeah, as I mentioned, I tried to really focus on bills that were still in play, still being considered. And so one of those is actually Montana that was cut, that died in, I think it was February or March. I think they missed a deadline to submit it. So yeah, Montana's proposal did end up not progressing any further. Or if it's okay, since we have a minute, I did forget to mention on the PFAS slide, I think it was a New Mexico bill. I forgot that actually just passed on April 8th, and I had it in my notes to be sure I mentioned it. So I'm getting it in right before the cut, sorry. But yeah, so New Mexico's HB 212 did pass on April 8th. That one's not proposed anymore. But for the Montana one, yeah, that one, we'll see what happens next session.
Brilliant. Yeah, perfect. You got it in time. Great. And just given the time, and we're going to leave it at that for the questions. But again, as mentioned, if you submitted a question or still want to submit a question, we'll reach out to you directly after the webinar. And with that, thank you all so much for tuning in with us today. We hope you found today's presentation helpful and look forward to seeing you in our upcoming webinars. You can check out our resources section on our website, complianceandrisks.com, to stay updated and to access our latest white papers, blogs, upcoming webinars, and of course, on-demand webinars. Thank you so much, Cassie and Kim, for your insights today. Really valuable. And yeah, we have plenty of upcoming content, as I mentioned, so keep an eye out. Our next webinar, ESG Regulatory Developments in the US, is scheduled for May 7th, and we hope to see you there. Thank you.
Bye.